Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our Hurricane Outlook and discussion for Saturday, June 11th, 2022. Another day and more things to talk about in the tropics, including newly designated 92E in the Pacific, as we talked about, with the disturbance that is expected to form. Of course, there now it's been designated an INVEST, which we all know just stands for Area of Investigation. We'll talk about that and more, of course, including new ukmet data that came in for this hurricane season. But first off, just want to thank everybody for coming in and watching today's discussion. Of course, like, subscribe, help us grow the family here on YouTube and the community as well. And without further ado, let's get started straight off the bat. Of course, nothing else going on in the tropical Atlantic in the next 48 hours and 5 days, and it seems like it might stay that way in the short term. Of course, we did talk about some signals that might be occurring for the long term, maybe in the Western Caribbean and Bay of Campeche, where models have been hinting at stuff. We talked about that yesterday. Nothing too much has really changed with that today, other than the signal is still there, obviously. Um, of course, we do have the disturbance out here in the Pacific, which obviously is designated 92E, and we'll take a look at a closer look up at what this might do in a little bit. But of course, it's a broad area of showers and thunderstorm activity that's just off the coast of Mexico. The NHC does mention that the organization has changed little since yesterday, so it's not organizing too much right now. But environmental conditions will be favorable for this to develop and possibly become some sort of system as we go towards the next 2 days. And the NHC has given this a 30% chance of forming within the next 48 hours, and the 5 day, they have this at a high chance now at 80%. Of course, just taking a look at how this looks out right now, and you could clearly see this really hasn't changed too much in its organization. And this is just a very, I notice that the loop is very long here, but I guess this kind of does put into perspective how this is not really organizing too much right now. There's a little bit of a convective blowup, of course, going on right now, but overall the system is not too organized yet. But let's just take a look at where this will go when it does organize. And the one thing that I do notice that the NHC did mention for quite a bit is that this is where it's, of course, located right now, but this will actually meander off the coast of Mexico, where environmental conditions progressively over time will get favorable. And this does pose some threat to the Mexican coast, as some models do try to take this in and make it have a landfall somewhere along the coast of Mexico, but it really depends. Some of these models want to actually take this a little bit further out and make this go a little bit more further towards the west, and some take this and just kind of meander this completely off the coast of Mexico and slowly start bringing this north within about a 5 day time, or I guess within a 3 or 4 day time. Within some of these models, is a little bit of a spread, of course, as to be expected, because things are still a little bit uncertain with what this does. But of course, we'll see as time goes on how that evolves. The 92E, of course, which what this is, an investigative area, 92E model guidance. Most of them do not take this to be strong, though. I did take a look at the GFS, and of course, as it always shows, and it does kind of have a tendency sometimes to overdo storms. It says that the GFS does bring this to a hurricane, but it does seem like most of the model intensity guidance here, at least presented, the general consensus is, well, there isn't really too much of a consensus. Most of them are all over the place, but a lot of them do kind of bring this to keep it weak. Only this one member here that brings us to an actual Cat 1 hurricane, while most of the other ones just keep us weak and not doing much at the current time. And of course, we'll see how that changes as time goes on. But I guess the bottom line is really just a storm that will form off the southwestern coast of Mexico, obvious at this point. Kind of meander around for a little bit before it then just kind of starts to move off. Maybe this will get a threat to the coastline of Mexico, but nonetheless, we'll see an increase of rip currents, especially as something does develop. And of course, we all know that this is all part of a bigger system essential American gyre, as we always like to say, the MJO passage that's moving through the Western hemisphere. And you can especially see that when you look at the visible satellite here, a lot of blowing up convection over the Caribbean, the Southern Caribbean, and also Central America. And you could clearly see that we have some sort of enhanced upper level sort of pattern, I guess you could say, where we have some sort of enhanced upper level pattern that allows for a lot of rising motion, and that's what we're seeing across a lot of the Western Hemisphere. Even here, that mesoscale convective system that, interestingly enough, came off the coast. Of course, this is all associated with the much larger trough that's in the Gulf of Mexico. Of course, not expected to do anything. I took a look at all the models, even the mesoscale models too. Nothing really has interest in this, even though the waters over the Gulf are warm, so nothing to be concerned with when it comes to this storm. But you can definitely see how the convective activity is pretty intense, and you look at all these other convective areas down to the south, closer towards the deep tropics too. I guess this does put into perspective that there's a much larger area of general favorability in the Western Hemisphere, and that's what's going to favor the activity in the Eastern Pacific and anything that does try to get going within the Western Caribbean and the Bay of Campeche. Obviously, will have that favorability too, as the MJO, as we all know, tends to always propagates eastward over time. Slowly, you're going to start seeing more of that favorability in the Atlantic, and of course, that's when models do within the next week or so time do start to bring some interest here, and we talked a little bit about that yesterday. But of course, nothing much remains the same today. Obviously, just really quickly want to refresh this to see if there's any new thing. But of course, we see that energy associated with the mesoscale system that's coming down into the Gulf, and then of course we have this huge area. Obviously, you can see where that's all associated with a lot of this convective activity that's all associated down out here in the tropical Pacific, and of course the deep tropics. And I would assume also, especially given how organized of a line I guess this is, it is more or less associated with the intertropical convergence zone. But I guess it does kind of put into perspective the MJO in the Pacific Basin, and that's what's favoring the activity here right now. But other than that, nothing else going on across the Atlantic. Of course, a very huge void of any noticeable vorticity in the Caribbean and Gulf, although out closer towards the MDR, you could see, of course, these little patches of vorticity, obvious with tropical waves. And obviously, as I did say with tropical waves, when you do see these signs here, it is obviously, of course, a sign that we do very much have hurricane season upon us. So nothing in the hurricane season realm, this is nothing too unusual. And of course, both of these tropical waves out here that you could see with the vorticity, obviously, none of them really do pose a threat to impact and possibly become any sort of tropical system. However, though, when it comes to near-term situations like we do see here with that mesoscale convective system, and as we always do talk about, especially when it comes to storms like Bertha, Mindy of last year, and also what we saw earlier this year was not with 90L, if you remember that. Mike O'Malley, a guy I do follow, a very nice weather forecaster. Mike, if you're watching, maybe you are, maybe you're not, but Mike is talking about next week an area of low pressure that is expected to exit the midwestern United States, the mid Atlantic, I guess, into the tropical Atlantic. And of course, you could see here a low pressure that comes down south from the Great Lakes, once again associated with a much larger system, of course. It's expected to move over the southeast and even the Gulf of Mexico, possibly, where the water temperatures at this point are very warm and remain very warm. Of course, we saw yesterday all the 28, 29, 30 degrees Celsius waters across the Gulf Stream and the Gulf of Mexico. They still remain. So this will definitely have that fuel. And he does say that shear will decline too. And of course, he notes that there's a high pressure that will be centered, that'll move west. And I guess that'll also kind of help bring the storm a little bit, bring the storm off the southeast coast. And I do know that there will be another high pressure that will be roughly somewhere in here in the northeast that'll kind of dig down south. And the GFS, I note in this run has them going off. I'm actually going to show you on the models here. Let's go to the geopotential height. He does show that there's a high pressure, of course, closer towards the central western Atlantic, and that does kind of, he does mention here high pressure over the central United States, that will situate, and once we see this low pressure, no, that's not the right thing. We have a high pressure here over the central United States, then this kind of move further westward, and then as we do see something move off the east coast, earlier models, I'm actually going to zoom in a little bit more on the east coast. I'm going to go toward to the 850 millibar vorticity. One thing you definitely do see, that low pressure there. That's the system. It moves down from the Great Lakes, moves off the East Coast, and I guess in the latest one, the GFS has a high pressure centered where it just kind of kicks it off completely to the northeast. But if we take a look, I guess, at a few runs ago, one thing you will see is notice how it's much closer towards the southeast United States coast, and even as far as just yesterday, in the 60 run yesterday, it actually had a pretty decent storm that actually tried to develop into something pretty clumped vorticity. And I guess this is because there was a high pressure to the north, and this broke off from, of course, that trough that was moving through, that came from the Great Lakes. It broke off, and it kind of got squished between the high pressure that's out to the west and up to the north. Kind of got squished in between, and it was able to develop, and that's how the GFS got this storm. In the most recent runs, it kind of backed off from that and had that low pressure kind of get kicked off. We're going backwards, not forward. But in the most recent runs, you could see I guess the GFS has a lot less when it comes to development off the East Coast, and a lot more of this front just getting kicked off. But I mean, you never know. We got, once again, those very warm water temperatures, especially along the Gulf Stream and the Gulf of Mexico. And of course, it's hurricane season too, and especially whenever you combine fronts that come off the East Coast, and if there's any low pressure that tries to develop, especially, the drill when it comes to the most recent years, something does try to develop. And Mike Romali does note that the shear will decline, so maybe we'll try to get something to develop. It just depends. But Danny Morris too, another thing to talk about is Danny Morris did say today that the ukmet June 2022 seasonal forecast is out, and it shows something similar to its May 2022 forecast for a very active season, which we all know is very much in place by now. The ensemble mean is trying to depict a positive AMO, basically, as we always talked about this horseshoe of very warm sea surface temperature waters. This is represented with the 2017 map. Basically, what is saying positive AMO basically means just the Atlantic is warmer than normal, and it does show that it's pretty similar to 2017. Of course, not as robust, but it does kind of show a similar signature with a decently warm MDR, not quite as warm as it was in 2017. Of course, not everything will match the most top end years. And then if we look at the European ensembles too, they also show the same similar forecast to the UK Met, and the precipitation as well seems to have gotten slightly stronger too. Let's try to find which one is the May. Okay, this is the May forecast, and I assume this will be that's the June, July, and this is the July, August, September. And then for June, he does note once again the precipitation has also gotten stronger on the models too, with some scattered across the Gulf and in a more out to sea pattern. But another thing that's also very interesting to me is he also mentioned that the heights indicate the 500 millibar heights, the upper level heights indicate stronger ridging over the northeast US and southeast Canada. Where the ridge is centered will determine the likelihood of storms getting west. And he does mention, if we do remember last year, that had a bunch of recurring storms, Sam and Larry had a ridge that was situated further to the north. allowing troughing, low pressures under that to drive these storms out to sea. And basically what that means is a less favorable pattern for the U.S. That was last year. And he does mention that this year has a huge ridge that's forecasted over the southeast Canada northeast region. And if you know anything before, especially with this ridge that's over top, like we see here right now, that's what we consider a ridge bridge, which is a pretty favorable sign for storms going west and impacting the United States. But of course, as he does mention, it is very key as to where the ridge will be centered, and that'll also be very, very much key as to what we see during the hurricane season, especially when it comes to impacts. So that is very important. And of course, a bunch of new data that is obviously very useful when it comes to looking at the long term of what we might see in the Atlantic. And of course, things we'll have to be watching very closely as the season does progress. But other than that, there's not too much to talk about. Besides that, of course, we're watching what happens in the Gulf and the Caribbean long term, and of course, watching 92E as it might develop, and it seems pretty likely that it will. So we have a decent amount of things to keep on top of. Not completely dead, of course, as we would typically expect in June, but of course not overly active or too out of the norm for June. Just right in between, just enough of activity to keep on top of, and of course we'll certainly be doing here. So if you want to keep on top, of course, you know what you got to do, right? Subscribe, like the video, and that really just helps me grow too, and so I can bring better information to you, get better resources as well, bring to you. So really, it would help out if you like and subscribe, of course, if that's what you liked, what you saw today, and of course, being subscribed, you would get notifications on whenever I do come to you. And of course, you get the notifications as soon as I post the video, so you don't have to go searching on my channel to see when I posted. Pretty convenient, and I say it's definitely worth it. All right, well, that does it for today's discussion. Everyone have a great day, and of course, we'll see you for tomorrow's discussion. All right, peace.